Within the human body, there are three types of muscular tissue: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Although the different types of muscular tissue share some properties, they differ from one another in their microscopic anatomy, their location, and how they're controlled by the nervous and the endocrine systems. So skeletal muscle tissue is so named because most skeletal muscles move the bones of our skeleton. As previously mentioned, they connect to our bone via tendons, and when they contract, they shorten, pulling on the bone and creating movement at a joint. Skeletal muscle cells, which are also called muscle fibers, are long and cylindrical. And they are also multinucleated, which just means they have more than one nucleus per cell. Skeletal muscle is striated, which means it has alternating light and dark protein bands, which give the tissue a bit of a stripy appearance. You can see those stripes running along these muscle fibers here. And skeletal muscle tissue works mainly in a voluntary manner. So its activity can be consciously controlled by neurons or nerve cells, the part of the somatic division of the nervous system. Although skeletal muscles can be involved in things like reflex arcs, where the conscious thought is not required to produce movement. When our skeletal muscle contracts, it responds quickly to the nervous stimulation. And when it does, it produces strong and powerful muscle contractions. However, relative to our other muscle types, skeletal muscle tires quite easily. Cardiac muscle is only found in the heart, making up most of our heart wall. And cardiac muscle cells or muscle fibers are short branching cells that are connected to one another by intercalated discs. So the intercalated discs are these dark lines along here. They're connected to one another via gap junctions, which, if we remember back to our nervous lectures, forms the electrical synapse where an action potential can pass directly from one cell to another, which increases the speed and the coordination of muscle contraction. And cardiac muscle fibers typically contain only one nucleus per cell, although occasionally there will be two. Cardiac muscle, like skeletal muscle, is also striated, although striations or stripes are not quite as obvious. And cardiac muscle is innervated by the autonomic nervous system, which means it's not under voluntary control, and that our heart beats us without us needing to think about it, and we can't consciously stop it or slow it down. Cardiac muscle tissue also contains a natural pacemaker that actually initiates each contraction and each heartbeat. Several hormones and neurotransmitters can adjust the heart rate by speeding it up or slowing down that neural impulse that runs through the cardiac muscle tissue, although this natural pacemaker determines that original heart rate or heartbeat. Smooth muscle tissue is located in the walls of hollow internal structures, so things like our blood vessels, the airways into our lungs, and many of the organs in our abdominal and our pelvic cavity. It's also found in the skin attached to our hair follicles. Smooth muscle cells are spindle-shaped, which is kind of like a long football, so it's thicker in the middle and then thinner at each end. And within these muscle fibers are only one nucleus. Smooth muscle cells lack the striations of skeletal and cardiac muscle tissue. This is because they don't contain sarcomeres and have their contractile proteins all lined up in parallel. Smooth muscle is referred to as smooth because it doesn't contain these striations. Like cardiac muscle, smooth muscle is also innervated by the autonomic nervous system, which again means that these muscles are not under voluntary control. This is why our stomach churns our food and our intestines propel that food forward without the need to actively think about it. When innervated, our smooth muscle cells contract quite slowly and less forcefully than skeletal muscle cells, but they are able to sustain these contractions for long periods of time. Now, I'm sure that you've guessed by now that I love a good summary table for condensing really large amounts of information. And here we have one for the 3 basic types of muscle. I'm not going to go through the entire table for you. I want you to have a go at that yourself, but we'll work through this first column here, just so that you get an idea of, I guess, how much detail that you might need to put into each box. So our skeletal muscle is found attached to our skeleton. Our skeletal muscle cells are long and cylindrical with obvious striations, so those obvious stripes. Skeletal muscle functions to produce movement, to generate heat, and to stabilize our joints. It is innervated by the somatic nervous system, which means it's under voluntary control. And lastly, skeletal muscle produces powerful and rapid muscle contractions, but compared to our other muscle types, these muscles fatigue or tire very easily. Now, just before we move on, I wanted to show you this illustration, which I think highlights really nicely the differences in the shapes and the sizes of the different muscle cells or muscle fibers. So we have our skeletal muscle up the top. So they're quite large, long cylindrical, so kind of round shaped muscle fibers. And you can see that they have multiple nuclei per cell. We have our slightly smaller branching cardiac muscle cells in the middle. So typically they will have that one nucleus per muscle cell. These lines here are our intercalated discs that connect each of those branches. And then we have our spindle-shaped, non-striated smooth muscles down the bottom. So kind of like the flattened out football, where it's thicker in the middle, thinner at the end, and we only have that one nucleus per cell.